Okay, hi everyone. So I'm from AbilityNet. I'm here today to talk about dyslexia. I come from AbilityNet, so I'm a senior accessibility consultant. Kind of if it's anything to do with accessibility, it's probably something I do. Might be websites, might be apps most of the time. I try and explain my role, and I often end up rambling quite a lot about all the audits or user testing or pattern libraries. One of my friends said that 9 times out of 10, it's just me saying that code is bad and I hate it. That's not quite true, but it is a little true. I complain about websites professionally. It's fun. You should join us. If you hate websites, you should come along. But I'm also dyslexic. And this actually isn't something that comes up in my job quite a lot. It's kind of something that's always on the periphery, which is why I'd really enjoy the opportunity to speak about it today. Now, one really big caveat I want to talk about quickly is that everything I'm going to talk about is really idiosyncratic. A big thing with kind of neurodiversity and anything to do with kind of cognitive things, for example, it gets a lot more individual, gets a lot more personal. It's not so much like a broken arm, it's something that's often very individual. So whilst I hope what I'm going to say today is going to be useful and informative for people, I want it to kind of potentially start conversations rather than people going away thinking, oh, that's dyslexia, because it's not. The images I have are artistic impressions of cats that perhaps aren't the best paintings that have been done. My analogy here being, if you've never seen a cat before and you try and paint the cat based on anecdotal information, that's probably what it will look like. So similarly, if you get anecdotal information about dyslexia from me, it might get you somewhere in this direction, which is better than drawing a dog, but still. So what isn't dyslexia? Because this is often the first thing that I think people often hit up with a roadblock. So people often say, oh wow, it must be mad. I've seen this kind of simulators and whew, golly. And I can say, and again, personal experience, it's nothing like the simulations. So what we have here is a CNN article. It's obviously huge press, appreciate more so in America, but you'd think it'd be very, very authoritative. And the title of the article of this is What Reading is Like If You Have Dyslexia. Now, I wasn't aware this is what dyslexia is like. I assume that that's what it's like, I guess. If you take mushrooms or acid, it's nothing like reading for me. And what I have to assume with this stuff, if I kind of give it the benefit of the doubt, is that it's trying to emulate the barrier rather than the experience. So similarly, if you were to wear like weighted clothes, you might think that that kind of emulates the experience of maybe having fatigue. It doesn't literally, but maybe get the same output. But or maybe I'm being generous. So what is it really? Well, it's also just broad. So we talk about things like affecting reading, spelling, issues, for example, with phonological awareness, kind of the idea of how the brain interprets sounds, kind of spoken grammar, and how kind of intuitively obvious that is, like how much language is just something that's innate and how much of it's a learnt thing and how many kind of roadblocks are in the way. And difficulties with things like verbal memory processing speed. A big thing with that, for example, with speed is less about intelligence. It's less about saying, well, if you just need more time to process the same information, you can get the same result. It just takes a lot longer for the brain literally to process. And what's not always part of the diagnosis, quite concurrent things, are often things like motor coordination, mental calculation, concentration. Now, again, what does that mean for me, again, as an individual? Well, it's things basically like my brain struggling with the information it's getting and vice versa. So it's not like words are literally jumping around the page. It's just that I can look at a word and my brain goes, yep, that's what that word means. And I can look at it for 10 minutes and then realize, no, it's not. But just it is literally my brain just not understanding the image that it's receiving. So it's more about that kind of neurological processing where something doesn't seem to work in quite the way you'd expect. And vice versa, where I have a word in my brain and I try and say it and a different word comes out. It just seems to be a kind of stumbling block on a neurological level. Also things like short-term memory and digit span. So where the kind of classic things of, I want you to remember this series of digits, 3, 4, 7, and I'm going to ask you again in 30 seconds to repeat them back to me. I can't do that at all. I like to think I'm not stupid, but I will forget that I can't remember what those digits were anymore. Congratulations to the audience if you can. So what was the kind of support that was available? Because we talk a lot about assistive technology, about assistive solutions. Well, for dyslexia, it was extra time. And this is quite a weird one. Because where you might have a screen reader, you might have corrective glasses, for example, you might have a wheelchair, there was nothing said for me growing up that was something saying, oh, this is going to solve something, this is going to actually help it. It was, well, you can do it, but with more time. And we can kind of understand some kind of the inherent issues to this, because I was responsible for self-correcting. It was this thing of, oh, it is going to be a problem, and you are going to struggle, but you can just struggle for longer. Now, the classic thing is exams, and people would often be jealous that I would get extra time in exams, to which, really, you want to spend more time doing exams in your life? And there's issues like imposter syndrome. So a very big thing that I've experienced in the kind of dyslexia community is this sense of, related to extra time, is things like the sensation of, oh, am I just here because I got extra time? Do people think that I'm only here because I get extra time? Do people somehow think that it isn't valid? And it kind of makes sense because the whole kind of paradigm is quite negative. It's all based around saying, well, we'll give you more time to do the thing that I could do in less time. So what's the things out there that change that? Well, it's technology, right? And with all kind of forms of impairment, disability, it keeps going back to technology. Now, my gifts playing? They are playing. I was worried they wouldn't play. So there's things like writing support. So there's just autocorrect that you'll have in your systems. I have something called All Global Autocorrect that kind of just takes some of the more manual process out of it, where on your systems it might say, come up with a red line, and you can go, oh yeah, that's what I mean. Global Autocorrect will kind of do that automatically. There's things like Grammarly and autocomplete, for example. And what I have side by side here is two GIFs of me. I was going to say doing the lyrics to the Shrek song. I can't remember what the actual name of the song is. But on the left, we have me kind of manually typing it out, making a lot of mistakes and constantly kind of having to go back and correct, but also just going very, very slowly. Whereas on the right-hand side, we have me consistently typing a word and then coming up with whatever the autocomplete suggestion is. And if we apply some kind of basic UX metrics to this, like, well, how many errors did the user occur during this time? How long did it take them to complete this process? And how happy were they then at the end of it? Well, this is a really small thing, but I can tell you that coming out of the right one, I got through it much quicker, I made much less errors, and ultimately I come out of it feeling like, yeah, no, that was fine. Like, there's no barrier to it. There's also things like text-to-speech. So where, for example, there might be screen readers which turn text on this screen into speech, the opposite is also true. So you might have heard of things, for example, like Dragon Naturally Speaking, where you can speak to your machine and you can dictate to it. That originally kind of started with law and kind of medical firms, where they wanted the ability to kind of dictate long articles, but then kind of came a boon for accessibility, because people, for example, like myself, who kind of can't write very well, could just speak to my machines. And here's me using the inbuilt tool that all of your iPhones, I'm assuming you have iPhones. You obviously have iPhones. And again, if you apply the same metrics with two GIFs here, one again me manually typing out and one me using the dictate feature. And again, if you go the same metrics, what's the speed? How many errors are occurring? And what's the end satisfaction? The dictate is, winning by country mile, right? In as much as it's not taking me nearly as long, not making nearly as much errors. And again, with dyslexia, something for me is kind of what I've just generally described as clumsiness. And the difference between going, oh, bloody no, versus just saying it, like the experience of that is way better. Oh yes, this is a video. But I said I get excited by videos. The other thing is also, because this is an input and output thing. So on the one hand, it's me as a user going, okay, I want to say this. I want to input this into the system. But as I said, there's also this issue with the kind of dyslexic brain in order of kind of reading something and going, nope, I don't know what that is. It's going back to the weird cat. So what I can do here, I'm not sure how to, oh, there's the display button. So all I'm doing here is, again, I'm using the inbuilt iOS feature of speech, and I'm hoping this is going to work.
Once told me the world is gonna roll me, I ain't the sharpest tool in the shed. She was looking kind of dumb with her finger and her thumb in the shape of an L on her forehead.
So again, and this is set to be super, super slow. You can set it to be super, super quick. But again, it's that very quick idea of you can speak to the machine, you can autocorrect with the machine, it can support you throughout your kind of creation of text, but then also it can then read it back to you. And that's kind of great on a very basic level. But I appreciate we're talking a lot about text, right? And there's more to life than just reading and writing. And this is actually one of the bigger ways that technology, I would say, has helped me and enabled me over the years. Because growing up, like, life is entirely about text, right? I'm going to show my age and say that I grew up in the 2000s, I think. Where everything was about text, and the most you would get is a smiley here or there. But if we think about how we communicate now and how we engage with users, have users engaging with each other, engaging with our families, for example, well, what are the things we do? Well, icons are everywhere, emojis are everywhere, stickers are everywhere, reactions are everywhere. We communicate so much with GIFs, for example, video kind of conferencing like Skype and FaceTime, things like audio with Discord and pictures like Snapchat, for example, which is entirely orientated around something other than text. They've become mainstays of our communication mediums. So, for example, this is me talking with my sister, and this is Facebook Messenger, and if we kind of unpack some of the communication options we have, because it's easy to say, oh, it's instant messaging, it's just text, right? Well, there's audio calling, there's video calling, there's talking via pictures, there's talking via video clips, there's talking via audio clips, there's talking via voice, there's talking via location, there's talking via stickers, there's talking via GIFs, there's talking via emojis. There's a lot of ways of talking to people that prior to technology just wasn't there. So those are the kind of ways that technology can enable, or I would say has enabled me. But what about kind of challenges? Because things aren't perfect. Well, if we kind of go with more kind of websites and apps generally, then the kind of issues I will often come across are things like unstructured text. So you just kind of walls of text and there's no kind of underlying structure to the information. And this is something that kind of crops up all the time with accessibility, being our kind of native, for example, on the web, our native semantics being used throughout. Are you using your headings? Are you using your lists correctly? Because that's a very simple thing between something being accessible and inaccessible. Images of text is another big one. So if I kind of go back to that example where I was able to access this text, for example, and get the speech to read it out, it was able to do that because it's plain text. If, for example, it was text that was encoded with an image, it wouldn't be able to access that because that's just an image. It's just pixels. It's not text that can be accessed by the system. Things like homonyms and homophones, for example, so the fair was fair or a pair of pairs. So when I kind of talked about that kind of neurological stress that I can experience, again, it's a stress that can be kind of particularly flare up around these kind of things. So again, it's just doing that pass on your copy going, okay, is this as simple as it can be? And are there any kind of words where, oh, those are pretty damn similar, or that's a homonym, that's a homophone, do we need those? And is there a way of kind of reducing your language to be kind of as simple, as pithy, and as matter of fact as possible? So things like abstract language or overly verbose language, which just unnecessarily adds a kind of cognitive load that often you don't need. You know, if you're not creating Shakespeare, and I mean, we're at Rightmove, if you're selling properties, you'd like to think that you could present things in really kind of simple language. And also an alternative to text, both input or output. So if I go back to this example, for example, with Messenger, if it was a communication medium that was entirely orientated around text, it would be something that I would say excludes me. But if, for example, you think on a website, small things like saying, okay, you know, we want to get a sense of how much you like this article. And instead of just giving a kind of review, a blank text field, if they say, oh, you know, we can give you access to sliders, we can give you a thumbs up icon, thumbs down icon. That's what I kind of mean by giving alternatives to just plain text being a solution for users. And I want to kind of step back again with challenges to talk about an interesting kind of UX issue that I experienced recently. So here we have the Lloyds banking app, and it says an issue I have is with my short-term memory. And my user journey with my Lloyds banking app was this. I open the app and it says, hello, can I have your username, please? And I go, of course you can. I don't know my username. That's far too long for me to remember. I'll go to LastPass, copy my username, paste it into the app, and it goes, okay, cool, thanks a lot. Can I have your password, please? And I go, of course. I don't know my password, and it would probably be quite insecure if I did, because I've got a password that no human being could remember. So I go out, I go back to LastPass, I copy my password to my clipboard, I go back to the app, and it says, see, the thing is, you minimized me, and that seems insecure. I think in the 30 seconds that you minimized me, I think your phone was stolen. I'm going to need your username again. And so I couldn't. The only way to get through this was to go, okay, I need my username. First thing, ask username, okay? I can't get out, so I'm going to write that down, and then use my password. Well, I have to write that down. And after this, there's some memory information. Well, I have to write that down. So in order to access my money, I have to fundamentally breach my security. Now, this is probably some kind of friction they've put in, thinking that they're benefiting the user, to which I ultimately just had to then entirely make my money insecure by I'm just writing out all of my passwords and usernames on a piece of paper. Now, they solved this issue. And I'm going to actually throw it out to people. I was going to get a prize for people getting the right answer, but I do not have a prize. If there's pizza left, you can get a slice, that'll be your prize. Can anyone guess what the solution to this was? Sure? Is that your final answer? Save your username? Ooh, let's see. It was Touch ID. So this was a very simple thing. So if we go from all of these screens to this screen, now that fundamentally enabled me as someone with dyslexia, right? Because it goes from, I need you to give me these several strings of data. I also need you to give them in such a way that you're keeping them in your head at all times. And if you leave me, you then need to go back to square one. And the idea being that that was somehow more secure. Versus, can I have your fingerprint, please? And I go, yep, there you go. Now, how many users is that enabled? Which of these user journeys looks better? That or that? So what can people do? Well, you can be succinct and simple. Whenever you're writing any kind of copy, have some kind of path where you're going through and you're cutting it in half and you're cutting it in half again, such that only what really needs to be there is there. Kind of section your content, like don't just have kind of walls and walls of information, break it up into its logical chunks, and use semantics. For example, use headings, use lists. If you're using, for example, if you're making apps, similarly kind of break it up into components rather than just being a wall of information. Because things like lists, for example, that's more than just, for example, a screen reader user having access to, that's a list item. It's also just making things scannable, such that I can really quickly scan through a page and go, that's what I want, such that I don't have that kind of cognitive load of having to kind of piece information out. And provide alternatives. Use icons, use graphs, use videos. Don't just have information only being there in that kind of text format. And what else? Well, you can provide alternatives. So in terms of kind of functionally interacting with things, I, for example, had on the Rightmove website was the kind of solution of you can A, put in your postcode, put in other postcodes, or you can draw a map. And that's an alternative way, it's a non-textual way, where I could have had in my head several postcodes thinking, well, I want to rent in this location, except I'm this far out with this many miles near here, or I can visually create that. Things like supporting multiple forms of authentication, so Touch ID basically. Avoiding custom keyboards, so again with, for example, the dictate options I was showing off, the autocomplete options I was showing off, it's things that are based on using the system level keyboards, whereas if you're, for example, doing anything with banking or things that require extra level security, there might be a temptation to forego those and having custom keyboards, which is a big no-no. And also supporting things like autofill, which might be like the HTML autocomplete, or for example with Swift using the UI text content type. And also recruiting user testers outside of your core target audience. So if you're if you can imagine on that kind of bell curve of users, if you're always straight in that middle, you're often going to get people that know what your acronyms mean, already know the kind of verbiage, are going to be able to look at your content and go, yeah, I understand this. And you go, cool, the user understands it, great. But if you kind of go out to those kind of peripheries of people where you think, well, I think they might be interested in this. They're not necessarily the core audience. You're going to get people that are kind of going to come along and say, well, this doesn't quite make sense to me. And you're going to be able to start those conversations of identifying what pain points are in your solutions, because often you might be really too close to them to be able to identify them. And if you kind of target that really core audience, similarly, they might be too close to it to be able to pull back and say, oh, that's where the confusion lies. And thank you. That is my talk. We have time for questions.
We do have time for questions.
Wow.
Hello. Thank you. That was really helpful and really interesting and fun. we've made the app for Tesco, and
You're not yet a business, are you?
yes.
I've got to work for you.
Oh yes, of course. Before we did this, I wasn't aware of the feature to be able to select a bit of text and have it read out to you, and it's used a lot. Another feature that's used a little less is reading the whole screen. I guess my question is this, and again, you're talking from your experience or from other people that you know. I'd like to know whether reading the whole screen or just using a screen reader in general on the web or on native apps, whether that's useful for how often that's being used for any other for non-vision related impairments.
Sorry, good for non-vision related impairments.
So, for example, when I try to convince my colleagues, okay, we're gonna, really do the accessibility right in terms of, the accessibility tree for the web, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
They generally think we're trying to remove barriers for people with vision impairments.
Yeah.
But I've also heard other people who say, well, actually, reading takes me longer and it's hard, so I use a screen reader. Is that your experience?
That's a really interesting point. I suppose how I would talk about that is this weird kind of thing with, I guess, equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. So with a lot of accessibility, we end up talking about just accessibility of opportunity, where we'll say, well, we've marked it up so you can access it. Your screen reader can interface with it. But we do a lot less with going, oh yeah, but you can also understand it. And that's the kind of thing where we enter the realm of kind of cognitive and neuro, where it's more so, oh, in addition to that text being on the page and it being marked up semantically, for example, such that AT can interface with it, also we're ensuring the user can access it. Now, a lot of that's just going to be use testing. Like there's going to be these strict kind of guidelines, for example, with neuro and cognitive stuff. 9 times out of 10, there's a lot you can do that will kind of cover both bases. So for example, if you are making something like that is either strictly against the HTML spec, that's strictly against the human interface guidelines, that's usually going to be pretty good, so in as much as it will interface with, for example, the screen readers and like the readers, like on iOS, it's the same kind of engine that's grabbing that text and pumping it out. As to whether there's like preferences for things like selecting bits of text and reading the whole screen, there's differences between like websites and apps, for example, and there's different types for different folks. Like for me, it's more so the ability to just get little snippets here and there rather than the whole page. But again, that's mileage will vary. So I appreciate it's a pretty broad thing. Any other questions? Have you had time to think of a question?
Yes.
If you want a microphone.
One thing that's part of WCAG 2.1 specification is line height, and I think it was a great addition.
Yes.
I'm super dyslexic as well, and that's the biggest issue I have. Is like if I go on a website and the line height is all over the place, and it's way harder for me to comprehend. Now, what would there was a font for a type for dyslexics especially. How do you feel font choices impact cognition and understanding, comprehension?
You had to ask that question. So big caveat, personal opinion. My view is that the research doesn't kind of indicate that, like for example, there's quite a few kind of fonts out there. A lot of the research I think out there is quite indeterminate as to whether or not it is truly effective or not. And there's a lot of kind of fonts that are sold at quite high costs and things like that. The thing I would say is 9 times out of 10, the bigger issue is making sure that the text that is there in the first place is as simple as it can be, is avoiding being overly verbose, is properly kind of visually structured before they then will kind of deep dive into the ability to perceive and process the font specifically. Like the copy is more important than it's presenting. There are things like kind of serif and sans serif where, avoid things that are super flowery, make sure it's just generally legible. As for kind of using like that super niche £1,000 whatever special dyslexic font, that's something I would less encourage. But like, for example, the BBC is putting a lot of like money and research into that kind of stuff, and you can kind of understand that they're doing it and they're putting a lot of research behind it. So that I can understand, but if it's more, well, we've got a company and we're just going to get something off the shelf, then that's something I'd probably consider a bit less. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome.
So, thanks, David. This is Ace. I guess the thing that inspired me a lot was that actually a lot of your recommendations would actually make things better for everyone. Like, it's like, titles seem like a good idea, and easily understandable text, a keyboard I can use. These are things that I think is quite easy, I think, to other these issues, but actually they would actually improve inclusivity across the board. And I guess with that in mind, I'm really interested to pick a bit into the emoji point that you made. And could you sort of talk a bit more about
this point?
Yeah, and just are there any sort of emerging do's and don'ts of emoji use for kind of the benefits that you referenced? But I guess from personal experience, it's one of the hardest choices of what emoji to send someone. There's so much cultural, so many layers of emoji, and that's before you start talking about stickers. Or I spend a bit of time on WeChat, and the kind of stickers you see there, I just don't, very culturally, they come from the cultural context. I wonder if that is a challenge you see, or if people have already started to think about good uses of emojis. I like the input ideas that you give about thumbs up and thumbs down, but obviously there's another couple of hundred there we could.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty good point. So all this stuff is really stuff that is just generally a kind of panacea for accessibility. So it was, apologies to the person in question, but the person that was here, came around there and was asking questions. Are they still here? Got at the back, where he was kind of talking about MVP and kind of agile stuff. A big kind of important thing for me is the idea that things don't start life as inaccessible. They're often made to be inaccessible. So it's less that if you make something that's by the books and it's clean and efficient and minimal, it's usually pretty damn accessible. It's more so things when get cluttered and hacked together and bodged, that's where inaccessibility is created. So a lot of accessibility you will find can kind of cover a lot of bases. It's not 100% true, but it's true a lot of the time. In terms of specifically the kind of emoji stuff, again, I think it's just being aware of your kind of target audience, what kind of areas you're targeting, things like that. Because I don't think I have a great answer for that, other than kind of doing lots of user testing, I suppose. Because I don't know of any kind of real hard and fast rules that stuff, other than use it where possible, but also ensure that there's alternatives to it, so they're not fundamentally relying on it. Because back to the point about things being generally accessible by using the same principles, one thing to think about is if, for example, you have a tweet and you have an image of text and then an emoji above it, that's not going to be the best thing in the world for a screen reader user who just comes across it and hears emoji with tongue out and graphic. They might go, okay. So again, but if you kind of sideline it with the text that you're trying to communicate it with, that would help. For example, me, where I can say, okay, they've got some text there, but what's the tone of that? I don't quite understand the tone because, again, it's that neurological processing I'm struggling with. Oh, but it's the sticking out tongue emoji next to it. Oh, they're joking. Oh, okay. It kind of reduced that cognitive load. So the only main thing I would say is ensure that it's always kind of next to some other information that gives it some context, some kind of anchor point, such that it's not entirely on the end user to do all of the interpretation. Because, again, it's about that kind of cognitive load. Does that make sense? You're nodding, so hopefully yes.
And our last question.
Hi, thank you. It's not really a question. I really love your talk.
Oh, I love things that aren't questions.
I'm dyslexic by myself, so I can really underline everything you said. Besides, underlining makes it harder for me to read. But I just want to answer your question about the font choices. I kind of agree with Open Dyslexic and other kind of dyslexic-friendly fonts. Me personally, I don't like it that much because it distracts me more than it helps. But there are actually fonts that it's harder to read. For example, if it's really sharp and really thin, it's harder, and also black and white, it's harder to read. So they kind of, for example, just Open Songs or something, like normal standard fonts are way easier to read for me than the Open Dyslexic or something. But everything else I totally agree.
Okay. I was really worried you were going to say I fundamentally disagree with us.
But it's, as you said, everyone goes through it in their own way and deals with it in their own way, so it's really difficult to kind of support on a global level.
Yeah, and a lot of this stuff is going to be how much you can. Oh, yeah, thank you. It's how much you can empower the end user to customize their experience. So more than just saying, oh, hey, what kind of splash of color do you want? Can you move that on to things like, oh, what typeface would you like? Is this font more readable, less readable for you? Is these color choices better for you? What size of text do you want? For example, it's quite rare for native apps to support things like dynamic type on iOS. But that's quite a small thing for me, is that I'll often just ramp up the text size because, again, it's kind of about for me personally, about reducing that kind of cognitive load. If that text is big and chunky and bold, it's easier for me to read. But again, it's that kind of small thing about enabling users to customize their experience, which often isn't allowed.
So your font choice is on brand.
I guess. You
Thank you so much. And
don't know if I'm being kicked out or not.
You are being kicked out.
Oh.
Sorry. And thank you very much to everyone for attending. I hope you enjoyed this evening. A big round of applause for all of our speakers this evening. Everyone's been fantastic.